Return to Auschwitz. The picture at the beginning here is the entrance to the main camp at Auschwitz. The slogan, Arbeit macht frei, means work makes one free. Return to Auschwitz by Kitty Hart. As a Polish teenager, Kitty Hart survived the Lubin ghetto and 18 months in the concentration camp at Auschwitz. In 1978, she returned to the camp with her son David. There she made the award-winning film Return to Auschwitz. A friend urged her to write a book before it's all forgotten. This selection, taken from Hart's book, which has the same title as her film. You see grass, but I don't see any grass. I see mud, just a sea of mud. And you think it's cold? With your 4 or 5 layers of clothing on a bright, crisp day like this, you feel the cold? Well, imagine people here or out beyond that fence working when it snowed, when it rained, when it was hot or cold, with 1 layer of clothing, the same layer, and no change of clothing unless you were a skilled organizer. And you couldn't take those stinking rags off or they'd be stolen immediately. Look at me, darling, to walk along the Lagerstrasse. In my day, you were not supposed to even set foot on it, let alone walk along it. I close my eyes, and there they are, those women, capos, and the rest of them, strutting up and down. It was forbidden for scum like me to venture near the edge of that trench or peer down onto it. I open my eyes, and there's nobody. I open my eyes and see grass. I close my eyes and see mud. Here it is. The gate between the 2 sections of the camp, which I had to get through to visit my mother. And there are the electrified fences. Don't go too close. The watchtowers still look down. There must still be guns in there, trained on you. I belong here. I knew I ought never to have come back, because it is proved I've never been away. The past I see is more real than the tidy pretense they have put in its place. The noises are as loud as they ever were, the screams, the shouts, the curses, the lash of whips, and the thud of truncheons, the ravening dogs. Here was where I received my personal education. This is my school. Education sticks with you for the rest of your life, whatever curriculum and discipline other people may cling to or rebel against from their school days. Here is where my standards were established. To obey or try not to obey, to revolt against or slyly circumvent, and always, either way, to fear, standards which, no matter how distorted, can never be forgotten. I walk on grass, which was once interminable mud. Beneath the green surface, the ground is still muddy. My feet sink in. It's not so much spongy as just that little bit wetter, so it squelches and threatens to suck you down and trap you there. So you breathe faster and want to drag your feet out and escape before it's too late. Imagine it. I can't imagine it any other way, with 100,000 people trudging through that mud, hearing the plopping sound of wrenching your clog out of the mess until you maybe no longer had the strength to wrench it out. In another 30 or 40 years, there will no longer be people like me alive. No one who can actually say, I've watched with my own eyes 1, 2, 3 million people go to their death. I would like you, David, to be able to testify that your mother was here, and you've been here with me, and tell your children what I've told you and shown you, that it will never be completely erased from history. I've had 30 good years. But most of the rest of my relatives, my grandmothers and aunts, and my father's family, and my mother's, and my school friends were robbed of those years. The ashes of more than 30 of my relations could be in this very place. Yet there are new cheats and liars and schemers writing that it never happened and couldn't have been true. So I must reply in these pages that it was true. All a myth? Come see for yourself. I'm trying to locate Camp B1. It all looks so alien. With so many of the huts pulled down or fallen down, I can't get my bearings. Some of the stone huts are still intact, but the wooden ones have disintegrated, leaving an odd pattern of little brick chimneys and heating channels jutting up all over the place. But this stone building must be part of B1. Look at it, and just look over there. When I close my eyes again, I see camps, nothing but camps. This one we're standing in was one of the smallest. Beyond it stretched the streets and terraces and factories of a city of slaves as far as the eye could see. There's the railway line I helped build over there. Not that I actually laid the rails, I dug ditches and carried cement. That's why my hands aren't ladylike. And there's where they often turn the dogs loose on you. Here. This is Block 20. One of the first of my huts. This door, where the blockstead stood, and where the bread ration was doled out, every time you went in, you were issued with your bread ration, usually with a savage blow as well. And inside, come in, have a look. Oh, yes, I often bought myself a place to sleep in one of those boards. Bought it with crumbs of bread, because if you didn't, you were liable to end up on the floor. Look at the mud on the floor and imagine it. Look at the end of the hut, too. That's where the bucket was, just one bucket, and you couldn't use it most of the time, so you lay in your own mess and everyone else's mess. No water, only miserable scraps of food. You were beaten all the time. How long do you think you would want to go on living? Here's the little room at the blockstead. Here she kept her roll call book, and here she slept, and here she had her own little stove to keep her warm. Outside, the meadow is green with grass. That's something I simply can't get used to. It was never like that when we stood for hours waiting for roll call numbers to match up. Never like that when women collapsed and died in the mud or froze to death on the hard winter ground. Another block, and what's this? A washroom actually attached to the hut. I never got as far as that in my Auschwitz career. Water was something you won only by bartering bread. If you could organize the surplus bread in the first place, you couldn't take it away in a container, so you had to bribe your way into some place where there was a tap. However miserable and polluted its trickle might be, I can hear it now, the negotiating and auctioning. I've got a bowl of water. You can have it for 2 spoons of sugar. I haven't got 2 spoons. Tell you what, I can manage 1 spoon and a little bit of bread. Here, another girl pushes her way in. If she doesn't want it, I'll give you 2 spoons of sugar for it. As for the official issue of drink, since liberation, I have confirmed what many of us suspected at the time. Soup and so-called tea or coffee, the distinction was hazy, both had poison added. Prisoners working in the kitchen were supervised by SS women who regularly measured out a certain quantity of white powder into whatever the liquid might be. We assumed it was some sort of bromide, but had no way of discovering anything about its properties. I recently learned that a Polish doctor is currently engaged in research into the poison, which is called avo. It contributed to the revolting smell of the soup, but you drank the stuff because you were desperate, and if you had no other food, you were in trouble. In the hospital compound, there was an abundance of lagersuppe, because few of the sick could swallow their full ration. Prisoners on the staff lived on the leftovers. Mother had a lot of it before she noticed the effect it was having. Drink too much and you couldn't think clearly all day. It gave you diarrhea, slowed down other physical movements, and left you totally confused. I am sure now it contributed to the degeneration of those who became Mussulman. In the camp there was one necessary implement, your bowl. I remember my bowl in Auschwitz was a red one. If you didn't have your bowl, you didn't get your soup. If you didn't have your bowl, you didn't have your toilet. And how did you wash the bowl out before you ate again? You didn't. Or you washed it out with your own urine. Here's the toilet block. That came rather late on. Even then, there were thousands of women trying to get in before roll call. And no paper. You mean no toilet paper? You must be joking. Over here, this huge cart. Now, I haven't thought of that for years. It used to be dragged into the camp loaded with bread rations drawn by male Russian prisoners of war, the few survivors of the 20,000 exterminated just before our arrival in Auschwitz. Once the bread had been distributed, the cart came in handy for removing corpses which lay by the roadside and outside every block. Oh God, this is the hospital compound, the very place where I had to help load Hanka and Genia on the lorries. Load my own friends on just when they were on their way to recovery from illness. That finished me. That really finished me mentally. Everyone went that day, everybody. Only my mother stopped me going with them or on to the fence. Mother saved my life then and on so many occasions. We couldn't have survived without each other. There was no way of struggling through all on your own. You had to have somebody helping you, and you had to help somebody else. Without some such bond, there was nothing to cling to. I didn't know much about the men's camp other than what I have read in books, as such as the detailed and deeply moving Oda Cross and Eric Kulka document The Death Factory, and reading it can never be the same as living it for oneself. But those authors and others admit that conditions in the women's camp of Birkenau were many times worse than those the men had to suffer. Down here is the Kanada enclosure, pretending to be a factory with a nice lawn outside. I close my eyes and at once the air is filled with screams. And when I open them, I think that this is the dream, for the building isn't here, and there are no longer any chimneys for the smoke to pour out of. We're walking through the birchwood now. There's the pond behind what used to be one of the crematoria. Yes, I'm getting my bearings. I can work out where it stood. And the sauna, look, it's still here, the very same one I remember. I'm going to scratch my name and number and dates into the wall. I've never disfigured a monument before, but this time I just got to leave a record behind, to go along with my Auschwitz record, which they must still have somewhere filed away in the camp archives. The path along which our capo led us to be here somewhere. So much is overgrown, but it must be here. People from the whole of Europe were brought to this graveyard. Just remember, that's what it is, a vast graveyard. I'm looking for the White House, but I can't find a trace. Over there across the clearing, maybe? Walking through these woods, that small group of us on our visits to the main camp, we saw, yes, here are the foundations. So that's all there is left? All that's left save for the echoes, the steady bup-bup-bup of pistols firing into the back of people's necks. The ground's a different color over here. Must be some pits or something. We climb up this mound, and on the other side, that gray patch, you know what that is? I dig in with a stick, and up comes sodden ashes and a piece of bone. Yes, says David. As a doctor, he has no doubts. This is human bone. A tiny morsel of one of the millions who perished here. Let's invite those people who say it never happened, invite them here and ask them to explain these ashes and fragments of human bone. And the empty gas canisters they keep in Auschwitz Museum. If there were no gassings, where did all those canisters come from, and what were they used for? My eyes didn't play me false. I saw just that sort of container being tipped into the vent, and I heard the sounds that followed. So many were exterminated that you had to numb yourself against any reaction. As long as there was a sea of people, death was too vast to comprehend. But acts of individual brutality still scream in my mind. A mother might be trying to pacify her child as she began to fear the worst, and then because of some other upset, the SS would cease the pretense of calm and orderliness. An SS man might come and tear the child away, pick it up by its head or legs, and smash it to death in front of the mother. It was something never to be forgiven. Mother and child were condemned to death anyway. Could they not be allowed to go to it quietly together? Even if there had been any impersonal logic behind the German extermination program, even if they genuinely felt their basic policy it was a stern moral necessity, then at least they could have let people go to their ordained death with dignity rather than under the torment of gratuitous brutality. If instead of those unknown Germans in Salzwedel, I had met one of the SS men while the dagger was still in my hand, would I have used it? I'm pretty sure I would, and I'd have had no guilty conscience afterwards. Auschwitz, the largest death camp, covered 19 square miles, located near the Polish town of Auschwitz. It had 3 major units, Auschwitz I, Auschwitz II, or Birkenau, and Auschwitz III, or Bucha-Monowitz. Auschwitz I was a concentration camp where the Nazis carried out medical experience. Birkenau was a death camp. More than 1,250,000 prisoners died in its 4 killing centers. Its barracks, built to hold 48 horses, often held more than 800 people. Buna Mosowitz held hundreds of thousands of slave laborers. 45 smaller camps nearby supplied cheap workers for German and Polish industries. The first prisoners arrived in June 1940. The camp was liberated by Soviet troops 5 years later. As Allied troops neared the camp, the Nazis sent the prisoners on death marches and tried to destroy the camp and its records. Evidence of their war crimes still remained when Soviet troops entered the camp on January 27, 1945.